All right, everyone. Welcome to the October Ivy Talk. I am Susie Farmer. We are excited to be hosting this talk today. I'm the Director of Education at Ivy Creek Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you all today. I would also like to welcome Miss Ellen Powell. Miss Powell is the Conservation Education Coordinator for the Virginia Department of Forestry, and she is based at the agency's Charlottesville headquarters. We are thankful to have Miss Powell with us today and excited about her presentation. Before we begin, just a couple housekeeping items. This is being recorded and it will be posted on our website in the next few days. If you have not muted yourself, please go ahead and mute yourself. And if you have questions throughout the talk, please put those questions in the chat box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And now I will turn it over to Miss Powell.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful sunny Sunday afternoon. I know there are lots more places you might rather be than in front of a computer. So we'll try to make it quick but thorough and then get all your questions answered if possible. I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. I'll ask Susie. Yes. Okay. Awesome. All right. Let's see. All right. I'm going to get started here. We will be talking about oak decline in Virginia, and it's happening in not just Virginia. So we'll cover just what that is and why it is a problem. And let's see. So I'm going to be covering actually two facets of oak decline. One of those being the decline of individual oak trees, and the other is the decline of oak as a landscape component in general. So we will go ahead and get started here. Okay, wait a second. There we go. Okay. Technological difficulties. So yes, just what I just said, two different kinds of decline, but we'll kind of lump it all together. They are related, but they're not exactly the same. So first of all, I do want to cover what oak decline is not, because there are a lot of oak ailments out there, and that one of them is oak wilt, which is, if you've been to Texas or that's a place where it's really prevalent, you may have heard how dire that is and how that moves from tree to tree through root grafts. So it's really hard to control, and it's also vectored by sap-feeding beetles. So it's really hard to control, and there have been a few detections in Virginia, but not in a very long time. So we seem to have kept that one out thus far. It is not established in Virginia, and that's a good thing. Similarly, we also do not have sudden oak death established in Virginia. That one is really prevalent on the West Coast. And that one sounds very dire just from the name. So neither of them are in Virginia. And so we're not going to talk about them today. They are not a factor yet in oak decline here. Okay, so if you look at the native range of oak trees and how many species are present in different parts of the country, you'll see one of the reasons that we might be concerned about something called oak decline. If you look at Virginia, we've got a fair number, 8 to 11 oak species in most parts of the state, a few more in some other parts. And across the South and Midwest, this can be a problem. If you look at a state like Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, look how oak heavy those are in terms of number of species of oak. So these areas are very much at risk of anything that's going to affect oak trees. So why do we care so much about oaks? Why is everybody always talking about oak trees? you all probably know the answers to that. The first one people usually come up with is wildlife value. And this is not just for the hard mast, the acorns that they produce, but also because oak trees grow caterpillars like nothing else. There are lots of native species of lepidopterans, moths and butterflies and skippers and things like that, that feed specifically on oak trees. And so their larvae are caterpillars, and caterpillars are the #1 food for nestlings of most of our songbirds. So if a tree is growing caterpillars, it's probably growing birds as well. When you look at some of the non-native exotic species that oaks are replaced with, particularly in, say, new subdivisions, those species are not hosting caterpillars in general. And so while you might be able to put up bird feeders in those neighborhoods and attract some birds, you're not going to be raising young birds unless you've got their food source. And so that is a huge value for oak trees. As well, oaks get very large and live pretty long time. So they make good den trees and good nesting trees for any species that might need a big cavity to spend the winter in or to raise young in, or lots of branches for nesting. So wildlife values for oaks are huge. As well, oaks are very prominent in flooring, furniture, millwork, and cooperage, just all sorts of uses of oaks when they're cut down. So people who are practicing oak silviculture want to be able to replenish oaks as they take them off landscape. We want to put them right back where they are. So they are very important for these forest products. As well, we like biodiversity in our woods. So we don't want, well, obviously we don't want all oak trees in a forest, but we do want oak to be a component of that along with lots of other species. And oaks just have this iconic status. You know, everyone thinks of this, the mighty oak. You know, it's a big, strong tree. It has big, you know, sweeping branches that just sort of, it's beautiful. It's aesthetic. So it's not something that we want off of our landscape. Okay, so a very common question that we get at the Department of Forestry quite often is, what is killing my oak tree? And I could take the word oak out of this and just say, what's killing my tree? Because that is often a question that homeowners have or landowners have. And oak trees in particular lately have been having problems, but there are definitely other species of trees that are being killed or dying slowly for some reason, and that can't always be pinpointed. It's great when one of our foresters can go out to someone's house and say, okay, I can tell you exactly why that tree is dying, but very seldom is that the case, especially with a large old landscape tree. So more likely, there's a big suite of factors that might be all combining to kill that oak tree. And we're going to talk about the role of some of these in oak decline today. So oak decline in general is sort of a syndrome. It is not a disease. It is not an abiotic factor. It is not an insect. It is a gradual failure in the health of the tree, and it results from a combination of factors that are either predisposing, inciting, or contributing. And I will go over what each of those things could be, but there are definitely an interaction of factors going on to result in anything that's called decline. A few years ago, you may have heard about white pine decline. That was really prevalent, I don't know, in the last 20 years. And that's still a thing. And anytime you hear the word decline after the name of a species, it's probably a result of a lot of different factors. It's not a specific disease. So some symptoms of oak decline. What do you see if you have it? Well, you might see the crown starting to die back, starting from the top down, working from the outside in. This is pretty typical of a lot of root diseases in all sorts of trees, that you see that crown die back starting at the top. You'll see a few branches sticking out at the top that are bare all summer, or you may see a few outer branches start to die. And that works its way down gradually over what could be many, many years. You may see premature autumn leaf color. If you kind of keep up with the fall foliage season in Virginia, you know that oaks are normally our last hardwoods to really change color. If you start seeing oaks changing color in September, then that might be something to take note of, because that's not normal. Even right now, as we're in the middle of October, most of our oak trees are still mostly green. There may be a few odd branches here and there, which is fairly normal in most trees. Sometimes a branch here and there will turn before another. But if you've got an oak tree that's already completely changed over and started to lose its leaves by early October, then that's potentially something to watch. Often the foliage will go brown after it changes color, but actually stay on the tree. And that is typical of, for example, white oaks anyway. They will typically wear what I call a skirt of leaves around the lower part of the tree for much of the winter, and that's normal. So it's often, you have to kind of observe your trees over a period of time to know, is this a difference? Is this a change? Because some trees will do these things naturally, but what we're looking for is what stands out, what's new, what has changed. And then sometimes with oak decline, often the tree just starts to look worse and worse, but it can take years, it can take decades. The trees on the lawn at the Department of Forestry building in Charlottesville, originally that whole front lawn, if you've ever been to our building, originally the whole front lawn was planted with different species of red oaks, mostly northern red oak and some pin oak. And over the years, those trees have started to decline. They actually have a specific problem that I will talk about later, but it has taken many years for individual trees to die, and they're being replaced with a multitude of species after they go. But it's just a slow progression. Oak decline is not a brand new thing. You can see from these little clips of articles from different years that, back in the 80s, there was oak decline. In the early 2000s, there was oak decline. There, in different parts of the South, this phenomenon has been seen multiple times. It's just become very, very prevalent right now in Virginia. We've really noticed an overall landscape issue that has some very specific reasons behind it. All right, so let's look at those different factors that are interacting to form an oak decline syndrome. First of all, we have predisposing factors, and these are kind of, in some ways you want to say this is what the tree is born with, but it's not necessarily just that. They will weaken a tree over time just based on where that tree is and how old it is. So poor soil is one potential issue. If a tree is growing in poor soil, it's not going to do as well as one growing in better soil if it's a species that prefers a more productive soil. Topography is also an issue because if you think about it, if your tree is growing at the top of a ridge, it's going to have probably less soil to begin with. A lot of that soil having gone down with gravity down the hill over a course of many, many, many years. It might be rocky up there, might be really prone to drought. So topography can make a huge difference because the tree growing up there may not be as able to overcome stressors as a tree that's growing down at the bottom of the slope where all the nice soil has collected and all the moisture goes. And there's shelter, and maybe it's a little cooler down there in that little valley. So these can be predisposing factors for a tree to begin with. Competition, if trees are very crowded, they're going to be competing for nutrients, for light, for water, and that always stresses trees out. Advanced age is a huge predisposing factor. And we all know trees live a long time, but trees do not live forever. And I think people forget that quite often. Is they think, well, a tree should live for hundreds of years, but not realizing the tree they're looking at may already be 150 years old. So, and depending on the species, that might be quite old for that tree. So these are all predisposing factors that can start to initiate that oak decline. And then, of course, genetics. Some trees are just better suited for their environment than others. People have different immunity ranges. Trees are the same way. One tree might have a genetic advantage over another one because it has some ability to fight off particular insects or diseases that another tree might not have. All right, so inciting factors are what comes next. And these rarely will kill a tree outright, except in a few instances, but usually they are a huge stress factor. They're the thing that comes in on top of the predisposing factor, and they really make the tree, they deal it a really hard blow. So one of the most prominent of the inciting factors are defoliating insects, and usually those are caterpillars in the case of oaks. So we talked about how oaks grow a lot of caterpillars, and that's a great thing. But oaks, because of that, they've actually developed some resistance, some ability to fight off some of these defoliating insects, except when those insects reach outbreak levels. And that happens periodically. We'll see a map in a minute showing you what sorts of outbreaks we've had at different times at different areas. But this is not going to necessarily kill a tree immediately. If you have 1 year where you have an outbreak of defoliating insects and the tree gets defoliated in May, let's say, that is a huge stress to a tree. If you have defoliating insects that defoliate the tree in September, not a big deal because the tree is already pretty much done for the year. It's not as big of a stressor on the tree to lose its leaves in September as it is in May. So if you have multiple early spring defoliations in several years, you're definitely going to be dealing a blow to a tree. Drought is another huge inciting factor. And that can be, we can have drought in parts of Virginia and not others in any given summer, spring, summer, fall, and they can last for different amounts of time. A healthy tree might be okay with a year of drought, but multiple years of drought or really prolonged droughts are going to stress even the really healthy trees. Frost and freezes, usually late freezes are the one we're most concerned about. Early frost is not as much of a big deal. Late frost can be, depending on how heavy it is and where the tree is in its formation of new leaves. And root zone disturbance is a really kind of one that people don't think about very much. If you've got a big oak tree in your yard and you decide to put in a new garage and there's some construction going on pretty far from that tree, you may still be disturbing some of its roots. Tree roots go out a very long way, and those feeder roots are in the top foot or so of soil, and those are really important to the tree. They may not be structurally important. They may not be what's mainly holding the tree in place, but they may be some of the main feeders of that tree. And so disturbing a root zone might give a tree some stress that you don't see for several years. All right, so we're going to move to contributing factors. So remember, we've already had some predisposing factors. Let's say we've got a tree growing in really poor rocky soil and it's old. And then there's a drought year, and to make it worse, you've had a defoliating insect come through. So you're really stressing that tree out. That's when opportunistic contributing factors come in. These are secondary pests. They are not things that can kill a tree that is healthy and growing. And most likely, if they even attack a tree that is like that, they're not going to really be able to get in. So these are definitely opportunists. They can tell when there's a stressed tree, and they know that's where it's best for them to get involved. So the one you see on the bottom left is the two-line chestnut borer. That's one example of an insect that can come in toward the end of a tree's life when it's already highly stressed. The bottom right, you see armillaria root rot, which is sending up some honey-colored mushrooms that you often see at the base of a tree that is really on its way out. So the contributing factors are what we kind of think of as the nail in the coffin. They're the last thing, and they're the thing that you see. Probably that's the thing that you look at and go, well, I see mushrooms growing out of the bottom of that tree. Therefore, whatever fungus caused those mushrooms has killed my tree. Not true. Armillaria isn't going to kill your oak tree, but it might be the final straw that takes that tree out. So like I said, boring insects and root diseases are two really big contributing factors, and there are multiple examples of all of these. So here's just a little chart that kind of shows you that all three of these types of factors contribute together to make up oak decline. It isn't just one root disease or one predisposing factor. The tree didn't just die of old age or from defoliators. It's kind of a combination of all three. If I were giving a test at the end of this talk, I would ask you what the three types of factors are that contribute to oak decline. That isn't just true of oak decline. Any decline syndrome is going to have these types of factors, and they may be a little different for different species, but they are definitely going to be all present in order for decline to lead to death. This is another way to look at it. This decline disease spiral, I think, kind of looks neat. It's like the death snail. It's you can see that the predisposing factors kind of come in first. So the environment that the tree is growing in, and factors that are in its environment that are sort of abiotic can actually affect the tree. And then old age comes in, and you get inciting factors like other things happening, defoliation, root disturbance, late freezes, droughts. So then you get the contributing factors that really quickly spiral that tree from declined tree to a dead tree. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of these individual factors, because I know people often have questions about insects and diseases they do see on their oak trees. So I'd like to kind of help you understand what some of those are, which ones are maybe somewhat important here in Virginia. So just remember, from defoliation, a healthy tree is going to recover after a year of defoliation. That's not necessarily going to take it out. But if the tree is already stressed by contributing factors, that may lead to a decline for that tree. And if you have multiple consecutive years of complete defoliation in the spring in particular, you're going to probably have some dead trees. So I'll show you a chart here, or a little graph here, of some of the species of defoliators that we have had problems with in Virginia. The dotted line is a combination of all of our native defoliators. Natives are the ones that our oak trees evolved with. They were here before anyone brought anything from Europe or Asia. And they are something that are typically cyclical. They will flare up in certain years and become sort of an outbreak level, and they will cause some of the more stressed out trees to die. But then natural predators, natural enemies, natural diseases of that defoliator will take it out and will knock the levels back down to a manageable level that the trees can live with. The blue line you see is fall cankerworm. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, but that is one that we do occasionally have outbreak levels of. We did have one in the teens, early in the teens, I think 2012, 13, something like that. There was an outbreak in certain parts of the state. And the red line you see is no longer called gypsy moth. It's now called spongy moth. They have renamed it. But so if you hear spongy moth, that is not a new insect. That is our same old invasive species we've been dealing with since the mid 80s. Gypsy moth, spongy moth, same thing. So you can see the huge outbreaks that happened from that particular species alone. And as you might expect, being an invasive species, that is an insect that did not have a contingent of natural predators. Yes, birds will eat caterpillars, hairy caterpillars. Some birds really like hairy caterpillars, but they occur in overwhelming numbers and probably, overwhelm their predator base in that way. They also, when they first got here, had no natural diseases or anything that would easily knock them out. And so they found they loved oak trees. They all are still here, by the way. We do see occasional outbreaks of them, but there have been some factors that have actually damped down gypsy moth in certain areas, namely a fungus that attacks the caterpillars in wet years. So it tends to really decimate the gypsy or spongy moth population. So you can see the ups, and what I really want you to notice from this graph is the ups and downs. Those are natural on any native defoliator. And spongy moth was one that has also been cyclical, but the magnitude of it has been much larger. And that tends to happen with invasive species. So yes, spongy moth, formerly called gypsy moth, it's Lymantria dispar. The female moth cannot fly. She's big chunky moth. You can see her there on the left, and her egg mass behind her, where she's been laying eggs on the tree trunk. They will also lay eggs on anything else that is sitting still. So, yard furniture, cars that sit around for a while, the side of your house, they might have laid eggs anywhere that they can crawl to. The males are flighted and come to the females to mate. So the problem stage is on the right side there. That's the gypsy moth or spongy moth caterpillar. It has 5 rows of, I think it's 4 or 5 rows, 5 rows of blue dots and 6 rows of red dots. So it has long hair on it, and you'll never see just one. If you have these, you will see thousands and thousands of them. So they really overwhelm a tree. That was my attempt to change the name. Sorry, I had to change that to spongy moth, and I did not have the original map to do it with. But this will show you the frequency of defoliation in certain parts of Virginia. These are not the only areas where there have been gypsy moths. There have been gypsy moths. When I first started, when I first started my career, I worked for Cooperative Extension, and I was in the northern neck of Virginia over on the Chesapeake Bay. And I was a horticulture agent, and we actually saw several small outbreaks of gypsy moth on the northern neck in the 90s. So they've been around for a while, and they've popped up in different places, but they've really found a home along the Blue Ridge and the Ridge and Valley mountains You can see some of the areas that are in red up here in extreme, what county is that? Clark County, I think, the very extreme northern county in Virginia. Parts of that county have along some ridge lines. You can see the color is, 9 or 10 years of consecutive defoliation. Those are the areas that you've probably seen from the road. If you've been on Skyline Drive, if you've been from Charlottesville south along 81, you've seen areas where you see bare white tree trunks. A lot of that is gypsy moth death. That's what's caused by multiple years defoliation of gypsy moth. If you've seen the brown trees in the middle of summer, you may be looking at an active infestation where the moths are actually, the caterpillars are actually have defoliated the tree during that growing season. And the trees are not dead yet, but they're declining. So fall cankerworm, we talked about as being one of the native pests that occasionally reach an outbreak level. So if you look at the picture on the far left, this is spring. You can see a tree in the foreground that's all leafed out. You can see a bunch of trees behind it that are either trying to put out more new leaves or have had all their leaves removed. And so these are, might think of them as inchworms. The cankerworms are the worms the caterpillars we used to call inchworms. They move by humping their body up and moving their back part toward the front part, and then they stretch out again. So they tend to congregate in huge numbers, as you can see on the bottom right, when they are in outbreak levels, and they are native, and they are our most common recurring defoliator. I'm thinking most of you, since this is an Ivy Talks workshop, most of you are probably from the Charlottesville area. We haven't seen fall cankerworm here really in any serious way, to my knowledge, in a very long time. But these are some of the areas that saw them in the early teens. I want you to notice this map, and then the next defoliator I show you, notice some of the commonality that you'll see. So Chesterfield County really got it bad, or not Chesterfield, Hanover, what's just that? King and Queen, King William. What county is that I am looking at? Just north of Henrico. I'm drawing a blank on the county. Somebody will know it. Somebody put it in the chat. I want to know. What county is that? No one knows. It will come to me. Anyway, this county right here with the big green blob on it.
Goochland?
Is that Goochland? No, Goochland's over here, over to the west of that.
I'm just throwing out what's going in the chat there.
Is it Cumberland? Is it Cumberland, Ellen?
It's not Cumberland. It's north of Henrico, but east of it. I think it's just maybe part of.
Oh, it's Powhatan, isn't it? Isn't that Powhatan?
No, that's to the west.
Oh yeah, sorry.
We're going to get bogged down on this. It's going to drive me crazy. Part of it's King William for sure. But I don't know what the other part is, and it's just driving me nuts here. But anyway, those areas were defoliated pretty heavily and did have some oak mortality after a couple of years. Let's go to the next page. Okay, my screen is locked up. There we go. Okay, so the next one I'm going to talk about, and I'll show you a map for, is the variable oak leaf caterpillar. It's called variable because it can have different colors, but it usually does have sort of two lines down the back split by a skinnier line. And it usually has a red head. I think sometimes it can have a black head. So they're very variable, just as the name says. But this can reach, it looks very similar to what you see, what you saw in the last one. It's springtime there. You can see some green trees, but you can also see some defoliated trees in the spring. Spring defoliation, bad. If that's another thing I could put on your quiz, if I were to give you one, is that spring defoliation of hardwood deciduous trees is generally very bad. That's when the tree has just put all of its energy into regrowing leaves after the winter. It's strongly growing, it's photosynthesizing, and then bam, all the leaves are gone. And just about the time the tree is needing to put on more leaves, because it's May and it's getting ready to be summer and they need leaves to photosynthesize, then we tend to get things like drought. And so sometimes that tree can't put forth enough leaves. It can't come back from that. But fall defoliation, not as much of a problem, because the tree has already had the whole summer, spring and summer, to grow, to photosynthesize, to put aside sugars for storage for the next year. So fall defoliation, minor usually, and spring defoliation is major. Okay, so look at some of the same areas. I think when we were looking at, what we must have been looking at is pieces of just the city of Richmond when we were looking at that last map, because north of Henrico, and there's King and Queen King William County. So those are some areas that were very heavily hit. Chesterfield is what really got it badly with the variable oak leaf. And I think that was, 2017. So that pops up in different spots. But the areas that you're going to see heavily in outbreak are going to be areas that have a good concentration of oak trees. So it's possible in Charlottesville area, we have a lot of oak. All right, I'm going to switch gears real quickly from defoliators, and I'm sure there might be some things in the chat. I'm not going to look at the chat until the end because I want to get through this, but I will come back to them, I promise. We will take a look at whatever questions might be in the chat. So I'm going to talk about a few of those. Remember, we are on contributing factors at this point. So we're looking at, well, we've just moved to contributing factors. Some of the root rot diseases that will come in and be the last straw for an oak tree. So armillaria root rot is one, and that's a fungus. It tends to be in the roots and the base of the trunk. And so it chokes off the water and nutrient flow for the tree. You will tend to see branch dieback and crown thinning, which is what you see in almost any kind of big tree problem. But the specific thing you'll see is some decay starting to happen in the roots and in the lower trunk. It's a secondary disease, which means by itself is not going to kill a healthy tree. But you've all probably seen this. If you spend any time in the woods, if you've hiked, you've seen trees where you could pull the bark off and you see these white mycelium in underneath the bark. You might see these honey-colored mushrooms right at the base of a tree. Harder to see sometimes are the rhizomorphs. They do look a lot like shoestrings. And they might be out in the mulch or out in the leaf litter even, not just on the trunk or under the bark of the tree. So all three of those are characteristic of armillaria root rot, which is one of the most common fungal secondary infections in Virginia. This one with the unpronounceable name, it's actually Biscognatia, and they changed the name. It used to be called hypoxylon, and that was so much easier to say. So, people, taxonomists, what are you going to do? Anyway, this is one that you've probably also seen if you spend some time in the woods. It causes the bark to start flaking off, and it looks like there are big white or gray areas on the tree. And usually you see it often on stressed out red oaks, because our red oaks do not live as long as our white oaks in general. And so they tend to be the first to go. And this, again, is a weak pathogen. It's a secondary pathogen. It's only going to kill trees that are stressed. It's going to be the final straw. These are some of the ways it can look at different phases in its life. Sometimes it's brown, sometimes you see gray areas, sometimes white areas. And that's just the fungus at different stages in its life cycle. Okay, this is another, this is bacterial. This is another disease that is prevalent on the landscape. And that picture is from our front lawn at the Department of Forestry. All those oak trees eventually are going to succumb to bacterial leaf scorch. They've been going one by one. We've taken them out one by one. We've started putting in replacing them with trees that are less susceptible to bacterial leaf scorch, because it is moving through the soil and it is moving through feeding insects. So we can't control where leafhoppers or spittlebugs are going to move in the canopy of mature trees. And so this is not something that you would try to spray for the insects on a forest scale, or even a large tree scale, and hope that it doesn't spread to other trees. This is just something that once it's in the landscape, it's going to run its course. These trees, as I said, are declining over a long period of time. There's one right outside my office window that is going to be the next to have to be cut down, because it is very much, it's all brown already and has lost a lot of leaves already. And it's gone. I don't know if it will leaf out next year. So this is a bacterial disease, bacterial infection, and is usually a contributor to the decline syndrome. This one can actually kill healthy trees as well, but it's quite common on declining trees that are in a stressful environment. So you'll see the leaf margins start to scorch, what look like scorch from the outside in, from the tips down. That picture on the bottom left is really, really typical of bacterial leaf scorch on the oak. And the canopy picture is also very typical of what you might see in the summer. And okay, so let's just talk about that. That was a quick overview of some of the more prevalent diseases and insects that you might see. But in general, let's talk about urban trees. Urban tree lifespans are shorter. If you are looking at planting a white oak in your landscape, and you are in a city lot, and you have different factors that we tend to have in cities, you might look at it and go, well, wow, that tree can live 400 years, but it's probably not going to in an urban environment. There are exceptions. We've all seen some big city trees that are really iconic and people love them. But in general, an urban tree lifespan is going to be shorter. Take a look at the picture and you'll see some factors that might be causing that. You've got on two sides of that tree, very close to it, you have sidewalk. You've got a tree that was planted too shallowly and has exposed roots. You've got probably really compacted soil in that yard. Yard soil in the city doesn't tend to be the greatest because they scrape off all the topsoil, sell it to someone else, and you have fill dirt, and then you have to buy some topsoil to put back in, and it's not really good soil anyway. So city tree problems, there's probably not really good nutrients going on there. There might be pollution problems. There could be construction going on around it. All sorts of problems that we have in cities. Heat island effects are a huge one. We always talk about trees mitigating the heat island effect of cities. Cities tend to have a lot of impermeable surfaces that are often dark colored and absorb heat and radiate that back to the surrounding air. And so you're going to be hotter in a city than you are in the surrounding countryside. But trees will also, not only do they help mitigate that by providing shade, but they could also succumb to that by having a much hotter environment than they want to live in. And improper care of trees, which I do put in quotes because people think they're doing the right thing for trees often, and they are not. If you've ever seen volcano mulching or improper pruning cuts that have been painted with some substance, or maybe tree wraps left wrapped around a tree for too long. All these sorts of things are improper care that people see other people doing, and so they assume it's correct. But all of these things contribute to urban tree problems. So what can we do? If you've got oak trees, there is no cure for the oak decline syndrome. As we said, it's got so many factors that you cannot target them all. And so what do? First of all, if you have an oak tree, take care of it. Basic good tree care. And you can find some wonderful information on the Department of Forestry site, but I highly recommend Virginia Cooperative Extension. They have lots of basic tree care information about how to reduce stress for a tree, how to properly water a tree that is being established, how to properly mulch it, how to properly prune it. Those things are super important. And as we know, the best time to have planted a new oak tree was at least 40 years ago, but the second best time, plant one now. You may not see it get to be an old tree, but that doesn't matter. If you really want, if we want to keep oak on the landscape beyond our lifetime, we need to continue to plant trees that are going to take a long time to mature. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little now about decline of oak in general as a forest component. This again has multiple factors. You can look at some of those factors, and I'll go over some of them in a little more depth. Almost no recent human activity is good for oaks. We just have not done anything that's going to really encourage them. Everything we've done over the last couple hundred years has been to the detriment of oak trees. We're lucky we still got so many of them. And there are just some things that we can do about that. First, we need to understand where it came from, but there are some things that we can do in terms of management now, and hope that is not too late. So some history. Prior to the last century, fire was pretty common on the landscape. We didn't have the dense populations that we do now. There were areas that, in the woods, no one lived in the woods. They tended to clear spaces and live in those spaces. They tended to come to towns and live in towns. And when fire burned through a landscape, they often just let it go. And that was actually good. That's something that a lot of our Virginia trees were adapted to, a fairly common fire return interval from not only lightning strikes, but also Native American use of fire to manage some of the landscape. So we have a lot of old forests that were adapted to fire. Also, prior to the last century, deer were really over-harvested, and that held true way up through a lot of the 1900s. There were hardly any deer. I'm sure a lot of you remember when there were not many deer. I know growing up in Eastern North Carolina being a kid in the 1970s and playing in the woods a lot, it was so rare if I saw deer tracks somewhere. And it was just like, oh, there's a deer. It was just it was uncommon. And so over-harvesting of deer for oak trees was a good thing. The Southern Appalachian forests, as you've all heard, were dominated by American chestnut as well as oaks. A lot of oaks came in after American chestnut decline because they were already there. They were on the landscape, but openings were made for them to become even more prevalent. Also, unfortunately, prior to the last century, we were in an era of forest exploitation, not an era of forest management. So the forests of the United States in general were seen as limitless. And like a lot of other natural resources, we basically mined those forests, just like we mined a lot of our wildlife species and a lot of other things. We just exploited them and did not think about replacing them. And that is to our detriment today still. So let's look at some domino effects. There was a lot of farmland abandoned during the Great Depression, and people moved to cities and left farmland. And so natural succession happened. Succession is the replacement of one plant community with another. that happens in a predictable progression over time. And what that progression led to in Virginia, much of Virginia, was dominance of oak and hickory forest. A lot of those oaks are, remember, we're talking about oak decline, so there is a connection to this. A lot of those oaks are now reaching mature ages. Think about that. They were established. Young oak trees started coming in the late 30s, early 40s. So those trees, if we're talking about things like scarlet oak, for example, and it's 80 years old, it's about done. And that's true of a lot of red oak species. They don't live as long as some of our white oaks, and they're getting old and starting to senesce. Okay, some more history. Oh, whoops, went the wrong way. Some more domino effects. So chestnut blight was a really unfortunate thing, and we lost a huge amount of forest cover. Some say as much as 25% of the Appalachians was actually this one species, American chestnut. So the loss of that canopy during the 1900s allowed the oaks to become established as a relatively even age cohort, meaning, within a very short time, the chestnuts died and the oaks were established from acorns in those woods. And so those oaks as well are now reaching mature ages. Okay, so that kind of, remember, old age, that was a predisposing factor. So we've had a couple of things here that have led to oaks being established, but then aging. We've had the Great Depression, farmland abandonment. We've had chestnut blight. So those two things, a lot of that was happening concurrently. And we've got some old oak trees that came in after chestnut blight. So then we had definitely increasing human population. Where there are people, we don't like fire, so we suppress it. What that leads to, eventually, if we're keeping fire off the landscape, we're going to have an understory develop and eventually canopy trees that are not tolerant of fire. So the reason we're starting to see so much beech and maple, one of those reasons that we see so much of that in the understory as young trees in this area is that they're not fire tolerant. They also weren't the ones that were commercially exploited quite as much as oak trees were. And so here we go. We have moved from a natural replacement of oak trees with more oak trees to replacement of oak trees with beech and maple. This also created much more competition for light when you change the forest floor conditions. You keep out fire, you don't have those young seedlings, you have a lot of young seedlings that can now come in and compete with oak seedlings. That's another stressor. Okay, so we've also had another thing that's happened in Virginia over the last 100 years or so, habitat changes that, and also harvest restrictions and more game management has led to an extreme increase in the deer population. It would be really laughable to my daughter who's 13 to say, wow, there was a time when I was a kid, there were no deer, because deer graze on our front lawn and walk down our driveway, and right there, they're everywhere. And we have a huge deer population in Virginia now. That leads to heavier browsing of the understory, and that makes it difficult for tree seedlings to get established. Deer love to eat oak seedlings. They're palatable. They're more palatable than beech seedlings or maple seedlings. Not that deer won't browse on those too, but they really like the oaks. Another characteristic of the last century was the desire for short-term economic gain. So there was a lot of woodland, a lot of hardwood forest, deciduous forest. And a common practice in the early days of forest management, not good forest management, mind you, but in the early days of it, was a practice called high grading, often referred to as take the best and leave the rest. where people would come in to a woodland and say, well, I don't want to cut them all down. I want it to still look like woods, but I need some money. So let's just take out the best trees and we'll leave all these other trees, and they're younger, they'll grow faster, they'll take over and they'll become big trees, and then we can get those later. Well, that's not how it works. Those trees that are left behind, they were not good competitors. The big trees, the best, were the best competitors. And those are the trees that would benefit from taking out maybe the less healthy trees instead, and letting them grow better, letting them reseed that area, letting them reproduce. Whereas the trees that are left behind were often gnarly, they were short, they were maybe not the trees that people wanted for forest products, but also not necessarily the healthiest trees that are going to produce the most wildlife benefit, the most, maybe the most acorns or nuts or whatever. So taking out the best trees and leaving the rest behind has led to much less healthy forest, often picturesque forest. I mean, I love to walk through the woods and see like really interestingly shaped trees, but a lot of those are trees that they were left behind because they were not healthy. They were not very good competitors. So we've had a lot of high graded forests are still on our landscape. All right, so we also have had some other challenges to oak regeneration. Keeping fire off the landscape, competition from other species, deer, these are all in summation from what we've just talked about. Also, we have a lot of invasive species nowadays. Invasives are a huge problem for tree reestablishment. They're a wild card. We do not know what they're going to do. Sometimes they do suppress trees, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're really a problem in one area and not another. But in general, if a tree is labeled invasive, it is causing some harm. That harm might be to native species. High grading we talked about, and then we have another wild card, climate change. We do not know, we can predict, but we do not know for sure what effects climate change will have on our forests. It will definitely impact the range of certain species. It will definitely impact drought, rainfall, flooding, things like that. We know that those things are all factors that could affect a tree. And short-term thinking and lack of planning is something that our Department of Forestry is really constantly trying to combat by working with individual landowners. We really want people to put thought into the next forest, not necessarily the forest that they have now, but what's going to come in after, for example, after a harvest, or what's going to come in after those old trees senesce and die. A lack of planning ahead, unfortunately, because of some of these other factors that we can't control, we're not just naturally going to get oak trees back on our landscape. It's become much harder to do. So the good news is we are trying as an agency and as a forestry community across Virginia and the U.S. Forest Service as well. We have come up with something called the Hardwood Forest Habitat Initiative. That is a program of the Department of Forestry. The goal is to ensure a future hardwood resource. And I'm not just talking about oak trees here. It is called the Hardwood Initiative, but oak trees are a huge, huge focus of this initiative. Parts of this program are a new hardwood assessment tool and a recommendation of practices that can be used by landowners to influence the amount of oak regeneration that they get. We are setting up demonstration sites and doing educational programs on those sites once we have them in place to help people learn about what they can do for oak trees. We are also trying to incentivize markets for oak, particularly for lower grade trees, because we would like to kind of clean up these forests that were high graded let people be able to sell trees that are not necessarily your stereotypical perfect timber tree. So if we incentivize markets for people to take out some of the lower value trees, then we have a better ability to help oak reestablish. Oak is not 100% shade tolerant. It's moderately shade tolerant. And so having heavy shade of other trees in the woodlands will keep oaks from regenerating the way we want them to. So we need to be able to take out some of these trees, but in order to take them out, there has to be a market for them. So there's more. There's actually, the General Assembly actually gave us money to create a cost share program for hardwood forest practices. That was major. That has not happened. We haven't had that sort of cost share money allocated since the pine initiatives, many, many years ago. So that is something that is recognized as being needed in Virginia. If you have specific questions about A, an oak tree in your yard, or B, the oaks in your woodlands or your woodlands in general, the best person to call is your local forester. And you can go on the Department of Forestry website, dof.virginia.gov, and one of the main things you'll see is find my forester. Put in your county or your city, and it will pull up the person that you need to contact. That is the best thing you can do. Our services are free to come out and look at your property and give you advice. We're not going to cruise your timber for you. If you want a management plan written for your acreage, there is a fee for that, but it's really reasonable. You can also get an independent consulting forester to do that for you to help you plan forest management. But just to have someone come out and take a walk around with you, look at your woodland, give you advice, that's what we're here for. You can contact me with certain questions as well, but I'm not an area forester, so that's my disclaimer. I'm not going to be the one coming out to look over your woodland. But you can get somebody to do that for sure. I also want to put in a plug. I'm going to hold up a book here in front of my face. I knew it's backwards. So, Tree and Forest Health Guide. This is on the Virginia Department of Forestry website as well. We do not have very many print copies of this. They were printed with a grant, and we're about out of them and don't have a way of reprinting them. However, the entire thing is available for free on our website. So if it's got wonderful photos, it has listed just about every forest health problem you can think of, whether that's construction damage, or whether that's variable oak leaf caterpillar, or whether that's fall webworm, or armillaria root rot, or verticillium wilt, or all of these different problems that you might encounter with Virginia trees. It has really good photos and descriptions of all of those and tells you how you can manage them. So I really highly recommend that. It's called Tree and Forest Health Guide, and it is a handbook for the diagnosis of urban and rural forest disturbances. Again, on the Department of Forestry website, dof.virginia.gov, and you can find that under publications. So now that is it for my presentation. I'm going to stop screen sharing. Actually, I probably need to look at the chat because can I still do that? Yes, I can still do that. I'm going to stop sharing, but we're going to look at the chat. And all right, so I'm going to go down starting at the beginning and try to answer these chat questions. And then if somebody else has another question, you can jump in at the end. So first question, is there any correlation between decline and mast years? I'll answer that part first. There could be, but not in general. So in general, oak trees do go through, mast year refers to how many acorns an oak tree is producing that fall. As you have probably noticed, if you have an oak tree, some years you have just so many acorns. If you have a white oak this year, you've got acorns underfoot everywhere. There has been a really good mast year for, at least for white oak. And there are other years where you can hardly find an acorn. That is a natural cycle of oaks. Oaks tend to do this. It's almost it's like flood the market with acorns, and so that some of those acorns get to reproduce. Some of them don't get eaten by squirrels and chipmunks and deer and turkeys and bear. Some of them on those heavy mast years are going to make it, and they're going to regenerate. It's just a natural strategy. The years that they don't have a lot of acorns, what happens to their the critters that eat acorns is they're going to decline just a bit. That can be good for oak trees. So if you can think about this in an evolutionary perspective, this is a good natural cycle. That said, a tree that is declining will sometimes put out a lot of acorns as like a last ditch effort to reproduce itself. I wouldn't necessarily go by that though. So I hope that answers that question. And then, does the term oak decline have to do with new oak not taking the place of dying trees? In the sense of what I talked about on a forest scale, yes. But usually when we talk about oak decline, we're talking about the landscape tree or the individual forest tree declining. I've used the term, as I said at the beginning of this, I've used it in two different ways, because the new oaks not taking the place of the dying trees is a huge problem. And that is a problem of oak decline as a forest component, if that makes sense. So hopefully I answered that question. All right, do insect outbreaks correlate with the decline in bird populations and climate changes to migration patterns? They could, they don't necessarily. The outbreaks, for example, that I showed on the maps, the variable oak leaf caterpillar and the fall cankerworm, those were not in response to a specific decline in bird populations in those particular areas. Those are just, again, natural outbreaks. They're natural over time. They have this ebb and flow, like a lot of predator prey, insect disease type interactions in the forest. But that said, that could, if all of a sudden bird populations declined and we just didn't have as many birds eating caterpillars, we would have a lot more outbreaks. That's for sure. So anything that is climate change related is going to have repercussions that we don't know about. So yes, I'd say all of that could happen, but it's not necessarily always happening yet. Invasion by English ivy, where would that fit in? Where you have English ivy going up oak trees, that is definitely a stressor. When it gets to the top of the tree, if it's covering the branches and foliage of the oak tree itself, it's going to decrease the amount of foliage that the tree can use to photosynthesize, and that is a potential problem. But in general, English ivy, say, just growing on the trunk of the tree is probably not going to have a huge effect on a decline syndrome, except for the fact that the ivy is competing with the tree for nutrients and water, that sort of thing. If you've got English ivy, keep it from running up your trees, please. If you can't get it out of the landscape, mow it. Just keep mowing it, mowing it, mowing it. If you can pull it, great. If you can't, mow it down. Because once English ivy climbs a tree and gets to the top and matures, it changes. It's like Jekyll and Hyde. It becomes, the leaf form even changes, and it starts to produce berries. Once it produces berries, they're going to get spread all over the landscape. So you can keep English ivy in a permanently immature state where it will not produce berries by mowing it or pulling it. So do that if you can. So here were our county guesses. There are all kinds of county guesses. Anyway, it's the eastern part of the state. So the status of oak regeneration in Virginia forest is not good. And that's part of, I think we kind of got through that through the course of the presentation. What we're trying to do with the Hardwood Initiative is come up with what are those practices for oak trees that really, or what are those forest management practices that will encourage regeneration of oak. Deer browse is very significant in certain areas. There are areas that are very rural, paradoxically, where deer browse is not as significant. And that may have to do with deer having much better habitat over a large area, and so not necessarily impacting every single tree. But around urban areas, deer browse is a huge factor. Oak regeneration is something that has to be planned. So if you have forest land and you are managing forest land, do what you can to manage specifically for oaks, to plan for the next forest. Look at what is in the understory of your forest. You know, you might like walking through the woods and seeing all these mature trees, and that's great. But if you're wondering what's going to come next, look at what is in the understory. Look at the what tree seedlings are in the understory. And if you aren't seeing a lot of tree seedlings, if you're seeing a lot of things like autumn olive, which is invasive, or you're seeing nothing but beech trees in the understory, that's going to be your next forest unless you do something. Beech is highly shade tolerant, so is red maple. They do great in that heavy overstory. And if an oak tree dies and the beech trees have a good head start, what's going to happen is beech trees are going to fill in that gap in the woods. If you do a harvest and you don't have good oak regeneration, other things are probably going to outcompete the oak. So there are some things that your forester could talk to you about if you're a landowner that can help you figure out how to better ensure that you might get oak in your next forest. Okay, so we have a person with a large southern red oak. Appears to be very healthy. It's a small lot. It got some fertilization. Should that be done yearly? I would not. If it is on an urban lot, I mean, I would not inject fertilizer regularly. And no, you would not treat it with antibiotics to stop. Antibiotics would stop a bacterial infection, but we never recommend treating a tree that doesn't have a problem. If you start to see a problem, there are some particular injections that can help. For example, like if you have ash tree and you want to stop, and you've got emerald ash borer, or you're going to have it, there are injection fungus or insecticides that can be injected for that. But no, pre-treating a tree is not something we recommend, because you're putting a chemical out there that is not necessarily going to help it and might hurt something else. So what I would recommend, if you have a large southern red oak is relatively hardy for a red oak, and I would say pay attention to what's going on around it. To the extent that you can control construction on the property, that you can control any sort of damage to the root zone, do that. To the extent that you can keep that trunk healthy, like don't run into it with the lawnmower too much, or mulch in a very wide swath around that tree, keeping that root zone cool. I think the best thing you can do, you cannot keep a tree alive forever. If it's healthy, great. Keep it healthy by not injuring it. If it has branches that need to be pruned out, use proper pruning cuts. You can get some great information about that from the Virginia Cooperative Extension website. I'm guessing Charlottesville area tree stewards. I see some names on here that I know for tree stewards. Probably have some great information about that as well. So there's some good sources of information out there. Okay. Somebody's cat typed a question. That's cool. Do a lot of extra oak trees in a suburban yard help with overall oak decline? Sure. I mean, any oak trees, having oak trees that are not too crowded, you want them to have room to grow. You want them to be free to grow, free from competition. I love oak trees on a suburban yard because that's great for bird populations. Those are going to grow caterpillars, and those are going to grow birds, and those are going to contribute all sorts of wildlife habitat, food, cover, space. They're going to be great for, they're like a tiny patch of urban habitat. So I say, yay, do that. If you can do that and protect them from deer until they get big enough to protect themselves from deer, great. That's awesome. Okay. Nature folks. I think you mean Talamy, Doug Talamy. Yeah, I think you mean Doug Talamy with this next question. The nature of oaks. Yes, a few is better than just one, but if you don't have enough room, oak trees take up a lot of space. And if you're on a 1/4 acre or suburban lot, you don't have room probably for more than one oak tree. But talk to your neighbors. And so if your neighbors can all plant an oak tree, then you've got a little bit more of an oak habitat area than just a single tree. But yeah, a single tree is better than no oak tree. That's my thought. Okay, so does anybody else have questions? I think we're running close to the end of our time here. And it's a beautiful day. It's getting cloudy out there now, so some people might be ready to go and beat the rain if you've got yard work to do like I do. Hopefully this was helpful to you. Again, if you want more information, please contact your local forester. If you've got individual trees you're concerned about or forest land that you're concerned about, check out the Tree and Forest Health Guide on our website under publications, and keep your oak trees healthy. All right,
Thank you.
awesome.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Powell. This was a great presentation and very
Awesome.
informative and very interesting. And I would like to thank everyone who attended today and spending time with us on this afternoon. I hope you all enjoyed it and learned a lot as well. We hope that if you have not visited Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm, that you will soon. As a matter of fact, on October 30th at 1 p.m., we're going to be celebrating the historic marker unveiling for Riverview Farm. This event is free and open to the public, and we hope you will join us in celebrating being added to the National Register of Historic Places, as well as celebrating the Carr Greer family and their legacy. Our next Ivy Talk will be Wednesday, November 16th at 6:30. And we will have David Kaka of the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. David will be giving a talk on Virginia's black bears with an emphasis on the DWR's efforts to understand the infestation and spread of mange in this relatively new host. This is free and open to the public, but we do ask that you pre-register just like you did for this talk. And you can do that at our website, which is ivycreekfoundation.org. If you enjoyed this talk and would like to support what Ivy Creek Foundation is doing for our community, please consider going to our website and becoming a donor today. And again, thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.